Hey, this short video is intended to cover the different theories of social movement emergence, which is how sociologists and other social scientists have tried to explain why we see social movements and why we don't. Um, what happened there? Okay, so we want to understand what makes a social movement start at a specific time in a specific place when it doesn't start at another time or another place. So, what are the conditions that lead a social movement to start, or what are the conditions that are necessary? Because sometimes social movements that we might expect never happen. The earliest social theory to explain the emergence and sustenance of social movements was the structural strain approach, which is now known as the classical model because it was so early. But the main thrust of this approach is that there's something going on in society, like industrialization, and that this makes individuals unhappy and that their unhappiness then causes them to come together and try to change the social structures that are making them unhappy. Now, some people would say, well, this is a pretty good explanation for the MAGA social movement. We might think about all the structural disorder, that's been happening in terms of the economy with deindustrialization and the move to an information society and the problems that that raises for the typical MAGA member in terms of job loss. We could also think how over the last few generations, there's been a real reduction in cultural support for racial segregation or for gender segregation or this concept of male superiority. Um, and this also plays into it. And then the internet, kind of sends us into our separate bubbles. So we're very isolated. People aren't talking to each other. Groups of people aren't talking across those divides. And so, in the wake of this discontent, we might see MAGA. Now, it sounds kind of intuitive, but the problems with this approach is that it's not clear why some structural strains lead to social movements and others don't. For instance, the 1920s saw a lot more and a lot more violent oppression of African Americans than the 1950s when the civil rights movement begins. So why, if there's so much structural strain, why isn't that the moment in the 1920s when we see the rise of the African American led civil rights movement? The other thing is that the model presumes that it's only unhappiness that leads to social change. And there are a lot of movements that are predicated on happiness. And I would say even the gun rights movement, which says that we are here to protect our happy society from those who would oppose it by allowing the free and frequent distribution of firearms. That it's not structural strain, it's a desire to keep things the way they are. So there's some problems with this, but this was the social movement explanation by sociologists, most social scientists, for about 100 years. But then, luckily for us, social movements became a major topic of study, and in the 1970s, a different understanding had gained the upper hand. This is resource mobilization theory, and this became the most popular approach for a couple of decades. And resource mobilization theory basically argues that we see the civil rights movement emerge in the 1950s and not the 1920s because there are more resources. There is more wealth. There are funds being brought in to, by African Americans and also by others. There are offices. There is more leadership. There are more networks. There are technologies that make organizing easier than in the 1920s, including roads, including, buses that are more available, helps people move. Um, we could use resource mobilization theory to explain, for instance, how Black Lives Matter arose later on compared to the 1960s, far more college graduates, more building of wealth, even more attracting of donors, setting up organizations, some with offices, even more development of leadership. You know, the original Black Lives Matter folks, like the original civil rights movement, they didn't just like meet in a bar. Um, they knew each other through existing organizations and networks. So it's not just discontent. Discontent is not enough. Resource mobilization said you need to have discontent plus all of these other resources. However, well, again, that seems to make more sense than classical model. There are some problems with this as well. And the main one is, if I can get my slides to move, there we go, that a lot of movements have been started and led and sustained by the relatively poor and powerless around the world, not just in the US. And in fact, movements historically have declined, have started to fade away when people with a lot of resources enter an existing movement. And we call people with a lot of resources elites. Um, but elites may co-opt movement goals with their resource provision. You know, we'll give you an office and we'll give you funding, but don't do that and instead think about this. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s is a good example. It's split between folks who only wanted laws to protect women's employment rights and those who wanted a more revolutionary overhaul of the entire gender structure and its relationship to race and class. And this really ended the movement when those with resources kind of took that legally focused route to protecting workplace employment, and left poorer women with few resources to advance what was really an early version of intersectionality theory. And there have been similar divides within other social movements, including ACT UP, where some of the activists wanted to kind of get some insiders into clinical trials versus others who wanted to overhaul the entire system of medical research and were left out in the cold when the insiders took the funding and resources with them. So this is the problem, is that often we can see that there are movements that are started and can be sustained if without resources. And so this led to a third paradigm, the idea of new social movements, which focused on the ways in which people were coming together to create a new lived reality, an alternative reality. And new social movements were things like Black Power, the Chicano movement, women's liberation, gay liberation, and the start of what we would now call the environmental movement, back then was called ecology movement. And these movements really operated as full subcultures. So they were aimed at developing new identities and symbols and a full culture. We can think about different symbols, the afro, the women's symbol, different ways of eating or disposing of waste. They're all these cultural practices and symbols that are part of these new social movements, which are more about a way of life. And activists in the new social movements were not necessarily the rational actors that resource mobilization theory imagined, where people are, you know, maximizing the opportunities to the optimal extent possible, but instead coming together to transform and to share a new set of identities and values. So this really helps to explain certain ways in which movements can come together without resources in the same way. However, it has been criticized for little attention to those resources. Well, some people have said, well, let's think of culture or let's think of identity as a resource, right? Not just material resources, but these other kinds of resources. The lack of attention to when people have buildings to meet in, money for a campaign, or, access to a continuing flow of money from donors, it's hard to understand, for instance, why attitudes to the LGBTQ community were so negative for so long after the emergence of the gay liberation movement, which had this whole new culture and whole new set of identities, but was making very little headway in the United States until AIDS wound up bringing gay activists into concert with people with resources. So there's a problem with just thinking about resources, but there also seems to be a problem with not thinking about resources. And this is why today, the theory that's most commonly used, most commonly accepted to explain social movement formation is the political process model. And here, the focus is on political opportunities and political threats. How do people mobilize when there are openings, when there are favorable opportunities? For instance, challenges to a Democrat-Republican binary allow people like both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, or Zoran Mamdani, for a more current example than Bernie Sanders, but people who are sort of on the edges of the Democrat or the Republican Party, who are these outsiders, to really emerge. And if we think about political opportunities, we can more often map when social movements can gain traction, can make sense to people, can gain followers. It's retrospectively, it helps to better explain social movements. And this model really focuses on where opportunity arises. So we can say that the civil rights movement really results from World War II's rhetoric about democratic equality, or the gay liberation and women's movement of the 1960s and 70s comes from the ways in which the civil rights movement set the tone, or the way in which Occupy, the 2008, 2011, that's kind of their trajectory, social movement, really arises from the ways in which the Great Recession and the crisis of Wall Street undermined a lot of politicians and opened up a space for grassroots voices to be heard and to make sense. And so this is one of the most widely shared views of social movements today. But there are some problems with it. It ignores the culture and identity part of new social movement theory altogether. And it tends not to explain failed movements. Like, why do we not see certain opportunities arising? Why, even when there are, a gap in the politics and a social movement arises, but it fails to gain traction. That is something that the political process model is not as strong at explaining. They can explain the emergence, but not necessarily the sustenance. But altogether, these four are the most shared views. Well, I would say, again, the political process model is the most shared view of social movements today, but all four kind of resonate. All four are still in some kind of circulation. And we really see that in these movements across society. They're in the media, they're in popular consciousness, whether we're thinking from the top right there to the left of the anti-Obama birther movement, the Women's March, the Proud Boys, Black Lives Matter, the MAGA movement, the DREAM Act movement, the American Nazi movement, the trans movement, the labor movement, across the left-right political spectrum, there is a need for explanation. And we can also think about these four models in terms of different levels of social analysis, or different ways in which the world works. The classical model is basically saying these big macro structural things affect the way people think and act, and they come together out of anger and get together. Resource mobilization says it's organizational resources that shape the ability of an organization or social movement to change society. New social movement theory, on the other hand, says it's the way in which people form culture, the identities they hold, that create social organizations that may or may not change society that much, but certainly change the people who are part of these social movements. And finally, the political process model is not well, it is like the classical model in that it's looking macro structurally to start what's happening in society, but then it's looking at how that affects organizations, how that affects social movement organizations and their ability to function, rather than how it affects people, the way the classical model does. So these are, when you're thinking about how to understand social movements, where do they come from? What are their causes? And how do they affect, or who do they affect? Organizations, people, societies. This is why it's really important to carefully look at the different ways in which these theories work. What are they looking at? What do they see as causal? What do they see as important outcomes? So, what I would like you to do for extra credit is to explain the emergence of the social movement we saw in the Canadian case in Water Warriors, and to first explain it in terms of each of these theories. How would each of these theories explain the emergence of this social movement? And then make a case for why one of these theories is the best one to explain what happened in this case.